The Roaring Twenties was a decade of economic and technological advancement with fast-growing individual prosperity where American ideals and morals were challenged. Despite the glorification of this era, there is a widespread increase in nativism and anti-immigration sentiment in both the government and the people of the U.S. This nationalistic post-war ideology was shown through discriminatory legislation, nativist organizations, and fear spread to all social classes. Throughout the rather inhumane pieces of legislation that passed through Congress and the progression of the United States, the two Quota Acts that were established in the 1920s were the first civilized pieces in regards to the inflow of immigration. This discrimination was towards the influx of Southern and Eastern European immigrants named the New Immigrants. The Quota Act of 1921 was a temporary measure designed to make time for the federal government to think of a more calculated way to limit immigration. This act established a form of counting the immigrants through visas or certificates. The anti-foreigner idea came from the increasing white nativist group. Warner Parker, in the quota provisions of the Immigration Act of 1924, states, "One of the greatest menaces of immigration has always been the entry to this country of the mentally unsound, and perhaps no one thing has produced as much hardship as the arrival at our ports of aliens, especially women and small children, afflicted with dangerous contagious diseases." Parker's words show the rising belief that America had become a melting pot of the discarded and unwanted Europeans. This quota was replaced by the Immigration Act of 1924, making the total number of each nationality inflow from 3% to 2%. In the Literary Digest of May 7, 1921, this Closing the Door on Immigration political cartoon portrays the nativist attitude that surfaced again after World War I. Uncle Sam is seen closing the funnel of European garbage with the tag of 3% after the first Quota Act to the United States. This maneuver of Congress during this time period provided an artificial cover over the subject of prejudice to immigrants. The formation of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan marked the second organized white nativist movement lasting from 1915 to 1944. It was a rebirth of the first Klan focusing on purging America of lawlessness, which targeted the new uptick of immigrants and the African American population. A newspaper called The Voice of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan from 1923 highlights the Klansmen of Minnesota, explaining their nature and ideologies. A list of many constitutional rights is spanned out with the Klansmen declaring that they are not in fact superseding the law but merely affirming it. Their sentiment was a clear display of white nativism. The volume states, "The Knights of the Ku Klux Klan is an organization of native-born American, white, Gentile, Protestant citizens formed to oppose by all legal means every lawless element in our country." It is a common misconception that the Klan was only prevalent in rural and Western America. Author Chris Romberg disapproves this in his article, White Nativism and Urban Politics, the 1920s Ku Klux Klan in Oakland, California, where he explains civic concerns such as moral reform, law enforcement, and city services brought this group into conflict with established ethnic group power in the urban machine. The prevalence of nativist ideology helped frame these issues in ethnic and racial terms, and provided a fertile ground for the development of a white nativist movement. The first Red Scare, which spanned from 1917 to 1920, had a lasting effect on the anti-immigration stance in the U.S. In Stanley Coben's article, A Study in Nativism, the American Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, he explained, "Psychological experiments indicate that a great many Americans, at least several million, are always ready to participate in a Red Scare. These people permanently hold attitudes that characterize the nativists of 1919 to 1920. Hostility towards certain minority groups, especially radicals and recent immigrants, fanatical patriotism, and a belief that internal enemies seriously threaten national security." The hostility from Americans was mostly targeted toward the new immigrants who originated from communist and socialist countries. When a new immigrant dared to speak out against the injustices of America's heavy capitalist viewpoint, they were sentenced to jail and, in even more extreme cases, shot and killed. A political cartoon named Step by Step by Sidney Green in 1919 depicts labor going downhill by walking down steps, which explains strikes lead to walkouts, disorder leads to riots, and Bolsheviks lead to murder, which end in chaos and confusion. It painted the Bolsheviks, a communist political party in Russia, as the leading cause of labor unrest. This was one of the main arguments for the anti-foreignism legislation and ideology which dominated the 1920s. The United States in its era of innovation transformed societal norms. This changed the general sentiment towards those from contrasting nations. The legislative branch had a large impact on minorities. New immigrants were unjustifiably affected by these laws and were mistreated by the country. White supremacy and post-war patriotism contributed to the creation of the second KKK. Change in perception towards immigrants fueled by xenophobic and ethnically motivated points of view led to a fear of communism. Each of these events and groups were created for the preservation of a white Anglo-Saxon nation of America's past.